everyone. Welcome back to the Kirkpatrick Podcast. Welcome back to March Madness. It is Vanessa with my dear friends, Jordan and Sarah. Hey, ladies. How are you?
Hello.
Hello.
So today we are talking all about level 3. Jordan and I killed it on level 4. Obviously, I'm biased. And we were like, oh, do we keep going and talk about level 3? And then we were like, absolutely not. We have to bring in our friend Sarah O'Connor into that conversation. There's no way to do level 3 without bringing in Sarah. So
Well, that's very kind. I'm excited to be here.
amazing. Jordan, why don't you kick us off? Give us a synopsis of what level 3 is.
Yeah. Level 3 is simply, I think, the point of training. So it's really focused on behavior change and being able to make sure that our training is used and applied in the performance environment. So it's really that link between what is being learned in training, aka level 2, and the business results that we're hoping to see as a result of training. That missing link in between levels 2 and 4 is where level 3, of course, sits with application. So if I had to sum it up, it's the whole point. Can't do it without it.
What do you both hear in the programs from participants? Like, what are their most common questions and challenges when it comes to level 3?
Hmm. I think one of the biggest challenges that I see is a lack of clarity around level 3. Like, what are the behaviors and tasks that are specific and observable and measurable? Because I think often we see trainings that are focused on topics and content, but it's not actually translated into how that should be used. So I think that's one of the first barriers, but I'll let Sarah kind of, maybe there's another idea that she has too.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to like grading blended evaluation plans. Well, I'll read something that just isn't actually a behavior. Like people will write a learning objective or something that is just a thing that people should know about or know how to do, but it's like the execution is missing. It's what are we doing? Where's our performance? The application, right? And so I think sometimes in our bronze programs, we'll be doing our activities where we're practicing writing them. And I think sometimes there's a question of like, what does this even look like in action? So having to clear that up for folks to make sure we're looking at what are people actually going to do when they're back at work too. Like they've left, they're back on the job. What do we want to see them doing? Observable, especially. What can we watch them do in action? For sure can be a barrier sometimes, and
Hmm.
it's important. It's really important.
So last night I was writing I finally finished it, by the way, one of the chapters of the book. And I was talking about leadership development programs. And I think that's one of the areas that it's so hard to write a critical behavior because it's like, what does an empathetic leader look like?
Hmm.
And I actually got into like a little bit of an argument with a friend of mine over whether or not because they were like, oh, there are certain things that we just can't measure. And I was like, that is false. And we started talking about like empathy. And he's like, well, how do you measure someone's empathetic? And I was like, well, you don't. You measure that, you give them what are ways that I can observe, like I can observe that you're being empathetic, right? Like they have to show up in a certain way. Maybe it's, you're like, even things like we were talking about this like in the sales sort of environment. And I was like, well, when you train your salespeople, you kind of like, don't you train them like, we're going to want to cock your head or like lean in or, whatever it is, right? But there's ways to define these harder soft skills like empathy and things like that into observable behaviors, and it's the package of those behaviors that then prove whether or not you're being empathetic or whatever the skill is. And I think that flip is part of what needs to be done at level 3, is really understanding there is sometimes it's like a roll up of behaviors and actions that are that soft skill, if you will. Like some people have the skill, but it's still a skill, and there's ways that you know that someone is empathetic or a good communicator, whatever the case might be. It's just harder to do, to write, or to define.
Yeah. And I think that's where we often tell folks to partner with different people in the organization as needed, because it might sound basic to say, well, what are they supposed to do with the training? But when we ask those types of questions and they're like, well, they should just know it. It's important to know. Okay, why is it important to know? Like, how are they supposed to use it? And if they aren't the subject matter expert in, let's say it's, empathy or really complex things like nuclear training and, mechanics. And if I'm not a mechanic, how do I know this specific behavior? Well, you partner with those subject matter experts or your stakeholders to really understand what should be happening, like what is the root of the problem from a performance perspective, and then train on those specific pieces. I feel like it does require more of that upfront performance analysis where maybe no one in the organization knows, and you need to take time to observe your high performers to figure out what it is that they are doing that's different from the low performers.
Absolutely. That's so funny that you bring that up, because it reminds me back to one of those phone calls that we got. I don't know if you were on this one, but they were like, oh, they want to be, there was a big issue, and a life or death situation happened. And so then training was assigned because it was proven that training was the problem. And they're like, well, we need more high performing, inspectors. And I was like, what does that mean? He's like, no one can define it. I'm like, okay, that's a problem.
Right.
And I think at the very, if we're going to take like, what's the basic thing that we can all learn and do at level 3? I think the basic thing, that basic first step, is you got to be able to define the behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, what are some other kind of areas where you see people are challenged, like when you're grading your blended evaluation plans when it comes to critical behaviors?
I think for one, yes, like defining it, getting it to align with those expectations where it is specific, it's measurable, it's quantifiable, it's observable. Like those are great ways to kind of start to dig into it. And then you get into like, how do we monitor it? So when we're looking at the blended evaluation plans, we have an area where we say, how do you observe it and who's doing that? And also, what tool do you use to capture that? And so I think it takes it even a step further to say, how do we, if we're talking about something like empathy, how do we then observe that, and what kind of method are we going to use it as an example? And I think if people either have a misalignment in that or can't think of a way to observe it, it can create a really large barrier into writing that critical behavior itself. I know we also, at least on those plans, we talk about having at least 3 or around 3 is like the expectation. And so I've had groups at times who either can't come up with 3 or they can't come up with a way to monitor it either. And so if we can't monitor it, then how do we know that it's even happening? I think that's a really big challenge sometimes. But it comes to writing a really high quality one ultimately that has that detail in place.
Is it the monitoring aspect, in your opinion? Is it that they can't monitor because, like, why do you think they can't monitor that behavior? Is it like a systems issue, like how the organization is set up?
I think it could be both. I think it could be that they've never done it before, and so they don't know what it might look like in this experience. And so either looking outside of maybe their system and function of what maybe they haven't done in the past, and like reaching out to another department, whether it's like HR or an analytics team, of like maybe they're capturing some kind of information that we can borrow that's already existing. I think if you don't know what that system even could look like, it can be really hard to pull it out of thin air. And we have so many examples that we can offer, but ultimately it's like what works in your organization, what are your people going to respond well to, and what
Mm-hmm.
kind of data is actually going to be helpful too. Like we don't necessarily want to just be pulling this information for no reason.
Yeah.
We want to be able to have it make sense and also not add too much work. But at the end of the day, we want to spend a lot of time in level 3. So if you're going to create a new system, maybe do it in level 3 because it's going to matter the most at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. So you touched on something that I think is kind of leading into what I wanted to talk a little bit about later, but like we'll just talk about it now. So part of level 3, which I think is a misconception, is that so like level 3, everyone just assumes is like, is the behavior happening, right? Like is behavior change occurring? But in fact, level 3 is really about monitoring and adjusting and really course correcting and being able to deploy support mechanisms and accountability mechanisms to ensure that these things are happening, not just checking if they occurred, right? Like we're not just developing training and then being like, all right, see you in 90 days when we go and send out a survey that you're probably not going to respond to tell me if you're performing the behaviors right. There's still that continuous support during that time. But one of those things that we talk about is required drivers, right? So like what are the support and accountability components that we are deploying into the performance environment in order to monitor, encourage, reward, reinforce these behaviors that we want to see. And so one of the things, which is the biggest, besides her being fabulous, but like the biggest reason I wanted Sarah here is because I wanted you to share more about the community, because part of my thought process with the community is like, I only know what I know, what I'm exposed to, my experiences shape my reality. And I don't even know what's possible because I just don't know, because I just haven't been exposed to it. And part of the reason for the community is so that other people can say, oh, I've had that challenge in the past too. Here is how we solved it. We've got some similar parallel structures or, whatever. And so you may be able to borrow what it is that we're doing. So we're not always reinventing the wheel. And so I'd love to hear from you, Sarah. Like, what are some of the conversations that are happening in the community, questions that you're hearing, like in the networking hours and things like that? Like, how are you seeing some of that help to support other people grow in their Kirkpatrick expertise?
Yeah, absolutely. I love any opportunity to talk about community, obviously. So I think one great opportunity here in the community is that we can pull together these folks from different industries that maybe they are that team of one, that team of a very small experience. And so you can hop into the community and see someone. We have it broken down by industry, which we can always expand to. We have kind of our big few that we observe that folks that are coming to Kirkpatrick really consistently, where folks are able to come in and share those ideas. And so we see people reaching out about motivation, people who are running their programs or running into barriers and want to see maybe what other people are experiencing. One of my favorite things that we saw, we had a networking hour last week from the time that we're chit-chatting right now. We're doing them every month, every third Wednesday of every month, an hour, optional, but please join us just to gather and talk about what's going on. And they're super casual, which I actually love. I think that sometimes we can get into these spaces where it feels like everything has to be really formal. And I think that we're sort of missing this easy opportunity to connect with others. And one thing that I really appreciated about our conversation last week was we had a handful of folks who, for whatever reason, are being impacted by some stuff that's going on larger in the US government right now. And it was on everybody's mind, really. And it was really evident quickly that, other folks were being impacted, their programs were being impacted. And what I noticed from those conversations is that we were able to have a conversation about how this group is doing it on this side of the country, how they're addressing it, or even just how they're feeling about it. And I think it can be so validating to sit in a space with these ultimately strangers, but we're all part of this community together, to say, oh, you're feeling pretty much exactly what I'm feeling. And at least, at the very least, if we don't come up with a solution at the end of this hour, I know that I'm not alone in that feeling, because it can be so isolating and you can fall down a really dangerous space, I think, if you feel like you're alone. And ultimately, you're not. But if we don't have the space to feel that connection, it can feel really isolating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jordan, you've done a lot of our public programs. You were part of the summit, and you do a lot of our private programs as well. What are you hearing in terms of need when it comes to required drivers, like out in the performance environment? Like, what are people craving to help them do what they need to do?
I do think some of it can be systems related, like you're talking about. Like, if we don't have a good tool to organize and sort through all of this data and help us visualize it, like that in an ideal world, like getting better tools to help with that process is what we hear a lot. But when resources are stretched thin, I mean, often technology is very expensive, right? So it's how do we operate within the resources that we do have? And that's where I think a lot of light bulb moments happen, because they're starting to see that there are systems in place, even if they're not technology systems, like a weekly one-on-one with your manager, or a department monthly meeting, or a report that the finance team is already pulling every month, right? Starting to understand that those are also methods of evaluation, I think help people feel like level 3 is a lot more achievable, and that it's already in the fabric of their organization. Because if they truly are focused on improving performance that matters to the business is already paying attention to that in some way. And even thinking about the inverse of how will I know when it's happening, the opposite of, well, how do I know it's a problem? How do I know that it's not happening? Might also point them towards methods that are already being used, even if it's something as simple as, if it's manager training on how to be an empathetic leader. Well, there's probably some qualitative data about how their teams are feeling about their leaders, right? Whether that is super explicitly documented somewhere, or it's just something that you are able to pick up on in other ways, right? Maybe there's complaints to HR, maybe there's just a lack of energy in that specific department, right? They're not putting out really great work, whatever that looks like. You can work backwards to figure out that the methods piece don't have to be super complicated, because that is usually the question mark that we see in our programs. Is like, well, how do I evaluate level 3 and how do I make it easy?
You just hit the nail on the head. My whole reason why I think that level 3 doesn't occur, it's not easy. I can spit out a survey for level 1. I can do a pre and post, or just knowledge check, right? Like, not even a pre. I could just do a knowledge check for level 2 and say, everyone passed with an 80%. Knowledge is there. We're good. Yeah. But then I get to level 3 and I'm like, oh, I've got to actually monitor this behavior. And I think we are waiting for this magic bullet to just solve the problem. And I don't ever foresee a full silver bullet. I think we're going to get closer to these things. But as long as, like, level 3 is a mix of not just sending out a survey. You've got to have conversations with people, observe, do temperature checks. Like, there's so many other things that go into why or why not behavior has changed. And I think that we discount the qualitative data because it doesn't feel as easy to synthesize and come up with, like, whether or not things are happening, as opposed to sending out the survey. And then, I keep dogging on SurveyMonkey, and we are, to be clear, we are a customer of SurveyMonkey. So we've used it, we like it. I'm not dogging it. It's just the tool platform of choice in my mind right now. But the SurveyMonkey spits back out to us a report, right? We get a dashboard. I can see exactly, I can have some pretty pictures telling me how we're doing, how we're not doing. And I know that we, evaluate our own programs, obviously. Imagine Kirkpatrick Partners doesn't do any evaluation of their own programs. I spend more of my time diving into the qualitative than I even care to look at the quantitative, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where the magic of required drivers actually comes in even more, because not only are things like mentoring, coaching, these community hours or social learning groups, communities of practice, even just, we were on a silver presentation earlier talking about lunch and learns, those types of things are required drivers, and they're supporting training participants once they're back on the job, right? But they are also evaluation methods, because rather than hosting a focus group in those community hours, you better believe that we're listening to the qualitative feedback, right? About how are you applying the model? What barriers are getting in the way? Those are our critical behavior, is that people are out there using the model to evaluate their programs, right? And so we can do focus groups, and we can do surveys, and we can do all the formal, oh, this is totally an evaluation method. But if I can multi-purpose a required driver to where not only am I getting valuable data at level 3, but I am also providing support. I am also building community. I am also building that positive peer support or even peer pressure when people start to hear, oh, you're actually applying what we learned in training. Oh, I guess I should be too. Those start to serve multiple purposes, and talk about good resource allocation, right? Those can be qualitative evaluation data. And yes, it goes back to now we just have to close the loop and document that somewhere. Or for us, I think using our AI note taker has been an amazing way to kind of collect some of that a little bit more streamlined. So I could talk for hours about required drivers. I think they make our lives easier and more fun.
Well, that's where the magic happens of learning, right? Is really in the required drivers, because it becomes a culture. It's not just the learning function that's ensuring things are done. It is also the manager being part of it, peers, right? Or just people that are, within the community that can provide some guidance and things like that. It is less about one human, one department imparting all this knowledge on someone else. It's this is we all want to improve. We all want to see the organization do better, right? No one wants to see their organization do worse. We have a kind of a weird climate right now in the U.S. So maybe right now people might be you know what? Let's see how everyone fails. And then we'll call some people back. Still in the D on that one, so fine. We'll take that one out of it. But no, everyone wants to see, organizations improve. You both are very invested in the success of Kirkpatrick Partners, because that as the company grows, so do you, and it becomes opportunity for others, right? And when we look at required drivers, that's really what it is, right? It's it's where the business grows. The business doesn't grow at level 4. The business grows at level 3. What we're doing at level 4 is just saying, are we on track? Is there something we need to go back and do at level 3 to ensure growth, or to ensure that we're, not getting hit with a compliance lawsuit, whatever it might be that you're evaluating, right? And so when we focus so much on level 4 and not level 3, and getting level 3 right, can't grow the business. Not going to happen. What's your favorite required driver?
I think it depends on the behavior. for me. I really am, I try to look at things holistically, right? So some required drivers are better suited for different behaviors depending on the type of behavior. But if I had to pick one, I mean, I love coaching and mentoring. So I, and I think a lot of organizations already value that and maybe have the opportunity to incorporate more coaching and mentoring. But I also just love a good job aid. Like, I'm a checklist girly,
Gonna say the
so
same.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Sarah, I stole your answer. I
I have
technically
another
give
one too.
a few, but yeah, a job aid, like it's so easy. I love a checklist. Like it's the dopamine hits of crossing things off, right? Like we talk about.
Oh
So,
my God. And there's
those are
so
a
many
few.
AI tools that can help you create them so quickly now.
Yeah.
So, Loom. Do you guys use Loom?
Yeah.
So I've been using it every time like anybody asks me to do something. I started recording myself and then I paid for the AI upgrade, which was not that expensive. And the AI creates the SOP, the step-by-step checklist, and then I just have to go in and like clean it up. But it's such a good first step where I'm not starting from scratch. Like if I actually thought about how long it would take me to do an SOP in the past or a
Oh,
step-by-step document, and now I have multi-purpose things. I have a video, I've got my audio, I've got like the SOP and the checklist all done within minutes. Like ugh, you just can't beat that. There's like no excuse anymore to not have a good job aid or checklist. Even if that's not going to be like your final format, you can take it and put it in your template. So good. So good. What about you,
yeah.
Sarah?
Love a job aid. You're also inspiring me because I do use Loom and I think I need to upgrade because you're inspiring me for some things that are on my to-do list of how that could make a huge difference for
Not
my.
the SOPs I asked you all to have done by the end of March.
I'm inspired. I'm thinking of all of the typing I thought I had to do. It turns out I'm just gonna have to walk through something, and I'm very excited now. This is amazing. Love a job aid. I also think that a what's the word? A misinterpreted one sometimes is like in the reward area. Like I think that sometimes we think reward has to be a raise or like time off or like things that are difficult for our businesses to actually implement or do because funding is always a
Always.
struggle. I mean, I think every program that I've ever done, someone says, but we have no money. Like we have nothing to spare. But I think finding those creative ways to reward people, and this might go back to former times of my life of just like shouting people out in those kinds of spaces. But I think finding ways that people love to be celebrated. Like I love like someone who is trusted in your organization, maybe not even like a formal leader, but like a locker room leader, if you will,
Yeah.
like calling and shouting out someone who's doing a good job, like how much that means to someone if that's a person that they really look up to. I think that there are so many ways we can find just chances to reward people and to celebrate them. I know a plan I was reading for a program we ran in December, they were talking about a brag wall they put up in their office and they had already implemented it. And people were so excited to be on the brag wall and to be
Yeah.
celebrated. And it's like, that's so simple. And it actually means so much to people ultimately. I'm a big celebration girly, so I'll do it all days of the week. But I think finding creative ways to reward folks is huge, really.
Hmm. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Can I speak on that real quick? I feel passionate about this as like a warm and fuzzy person. I feel like I have tried to justify like why the relational things matter.
hmm
And in the traditional business world, it's especially evaluation where it's seen as so black and white. It's like, okay, we don't have time for that,
Yeah.
or that's not productive, or whatever that might mean. And I've just always intuitively felt like we are missing such an opportunity because just like you said, Sarah, not only is it free, but like that's the difference maker. People aren't doing that because they don't think that that type of connection or reward, recognition, whatever it is appropriate. But making people feel good is just, I mean, it's part of our shared humanity, right? And so that little simple trick can be I don't know. I feel like it can speak volumes. So I just wanted to like give you some recognition for giving that idea.
Oh, brain blast today. I love it. Thank you, Jordan.
Um, you know, I think that this sort of like this reward and recognition, I think it's only gonna grow as a need. Because at a certain point, organizations have to figure out like, all right, well, we can't like keep giving everyone raises. You know what I mean? Like at a certain point, those things kind of tap out, right? Commensurate with your ability, and like the actual funding that you have, right?
Or
And
it
it's only
happens
once a year.
What?
Jinx.
Or it only happens once a year. A lot of times businesses only have it built into their function to do it at their annual review. So it's such a
Correct.
limiting time factor.
Correct.
Mhm.
If someone owe each other, is it like a Diet Coke or something like that, or a Coke? Is that what happens?
Yeah, Jinx, you owe me a soda.
Yeah, my daughters
What a
do that
line.
too now. And then they get me to
Lonnie.
like say their name. It's like a whole thing. And then I'm like, Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice, Beetlejuice. Like, what are we doing here? Anyhow,
You got extra steps. Oh my goodness.
I know, here he comes. Good thing I'm not wearing my black and white outfit today. And I think we like, okay, here's my thought as you were saying that whole thing about like, well, people don't think it's like appropriate or whatever for work. But like, do they not like outside of work, you like being recognized, right? In some way, shape, or form. Even me who like doesn't like being recognized, like there's still a little hint that it's like, okay, yes, you see me. You know what I mean? Like you still get a little bit of that dopamine hit. Don't do it for too long. Leave me the frick alone. But for like a moment, yes, I do like it. And I think that everyone, no matter how stone cold your heart might be, you know, even the Grinch ended up having a heart at the end. You know, it just took like a little Cindy Lou Who to like bring it out of him. I think the same can be said about like reward and recognition. It's that, and I will admit I'm not the greatest at this, is like stopping what you're doing to remember that like I may not need the reward or recognition to do what I need to do, but others do. And it really doesn't cost time out of my day. And it's really something that like, as silly as this sounds and as like awful as this kind of sounds, like just put it on your calendar. You know, like literally schedule it into your day. Because what, for me, like if it doesn't get written down, it doesn't get done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yes, it feels awful that you feel like you have to write down the fact that you have to recognize your team, but it's like, write it down and do it. And you will see that people will absolutely show you a different side of them and more of that behavior because you are doing those recognition pieces as well. So recognition definitely does not get enough time. I personally, you know, I love marketing. I'm a drip feed girl.
That's one that we get a lot of questions on.
I
Yeah.
think I might. I'm not going to claim that I added it to the required drivers list, but I think my influence may have. I don't know. But I think that we overwhelm our learners and we don't think about the value of like dripping out content when appropriate. Like I talk a lot about this example in particular, like new manager onboarding. You probably are taught interviewing, or you're probably taught how to do a performance review. But like to what the point you all just made, performance reviews happen only once a year. If they have just happened, I'm not actually going to do that behavior for a whole nother year. And then you're going to want me to remember what I learned during a performance review. Like, good luck. And I'm definitely not going back to the training if it's like an e-learning or something like that. I'm just going to wing it. So why are we not taking our content and dripping it out in the point of need, right? Or like right before they're actually need to exhibit that behavior to give it a higher likelihood that they're going to transfer the learning to behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And it just helps with cognitive load. And I think you can just be so creative about the types of media that you use, where you drip the content out. Like, it doesn't have to all be via email. You can use your Teams. You can use like your intranet. There's so many ways that you can drip out educational content and make it multi-purposeful. So,
Yeah. And I think that even goes back a little bit to what we were talking about with defining the behaviors and fully understanding what that looks like on the job. Because if you don't have the insight and you're not a partner with the business where you know when those behaviors are happening, what it actually looks like if you don't know that stuff, you can't send effective drip feeds and attach the template of what they should use in their performance review if you don't know when those are happening, or you don't know what method of communication your learners are actually paying attention to, right? If you're only sharing news in the LMS and they never log into the LMS, it's not going to matter. If you know that they're on Teams all the time, maybe you use a Teams chat instead, but that just requires that you have enough awareness of the performance environment and where that behavior actually takes place. So,
yeah,
love
I
that.
love it. Well, what's your one takeaway that you want people to like, your one thing, one small step that someone can do to make level 3 happen? One small little thing.
Reach out to the Kirkpatrick Partners community and connect with people in your industry. Come up with some ideas of what other people are doing. That's my one easy, accessible way.
Yep.
The thought that came to mind first, which I'm trying to make more specific so that it feels like a very easy task, is the talking to people part, where you're actually, maybe it means you put some time on the calendar to actually follow up with your participants. It doesn't have to be a formal focus group and, super structured. Like Sarah was saying, sometimes we think these things have to be more complicated and more structured and formal than they do. But as much time as you're putting into planning the instructional design, make sure you're building in at least the same amount of time to follow up and talk to people, whether it's your stakeholders, your participants themselves, their managers. Like, put it on your calendar.
Totally. I think if you want to start doing something different at level 3 to start is we didn't talk about this, but I wouldn't wait 90 days to start measuring what's happening in the performance environment.
Yeah.
We've all forgotten by then, to be clear. Like, if I'm not immediately applying it, I'm probably not going to remember it. And so having some sort of like 3 required drivers, your check-ins and things like that at your, within the first 30 days, then measuring 30, 60, 90, like what is actually happening, and then being very intentional about those first 30 is where you'll actually see like change. The first 30, you're not necessarily measuring if they're, what's happening. It's more like reminders of like, here's your support. If you're adding any sort of continual support is where you're deploying your required drivers, or beginning to. And then at 30, 60, 90, seeing what kind of change is occurring. Is there high change at 30, but then it drops off at 60 or, whatever the case might be. But the traditional, we have to wait 90 days. No way. And then for those programs where it's really hard to get access to the participants, if you haven't been on top of mind for them for 90 days, they're not going to prioritize giving you that time to give you feedback. So that would be my recommendation, is shifting how you are doing measurement at level 3, like the frequency of it, and then also being intentional and remembering like not everything has to be a survey.
True.
Well, Jordan and Sarah, thank you so much for being here with me today in our March Madness series. And friends, we will catch you all in the next episode where we talk all about level 2 learning. Thanks, everyone. Bye.